very, very warm welcome to another episode on Awaz-e-Haqiqat that stands for the voice of truth. Today or tonight, depending on whichever part of the world you're listening to us from, I am joined by an extraordinary guest, and this is the second time she has given me some time out of a very busy schedule. And the topic, most importantly, this is a topic that we don't quite come across in a general conversation and it needs to be talked about. We're talking and we are going to discuss and we're going to hear more from her on genetic carrier screening. What does it entail? Why are we talking about it? And much more. I'm very, very honored and privileged to be having this conversation with Dr. Nisha Khot, who is the president of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, RANZCOG, the peak organization representing ONG specialists and training the future generations of women's health specialists. She is also the clinical director of obstetrics and gynecology at Bayside Peninsula Health in Melbourne. She trained in India and the UK before moving to Australia in 2010. Dr. Kaur also chairs the board of Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, a not-for-profit organization providing health education to women from multicultural communities. She's passionate about gender equity and diversity, especially in healthcare leadership. Thank you so much, Doctor. Good evening, and how are you doing?
I'm good, and thanks for having me again, Chris.
It's my pleasure all the time. Thank you. Because I know how occupied you are. So I'll directly get into the topic, Doctor. As you mentioned, it's very important. Even when you had suggested this to me the first time, I also had to do my research because obviously as laymen, we have not quite heard about this term. So my first question to you, Doctor, is what is reproductive carrier screening and how does it differ from diagnostic genetic testing?
Chris, first of all, before we talk about reproductive carrier screening, we have to understand what is being tested for. So if we think about any living thing, whether it is plants, whether it's animals, whether it's humans, we are made up of billions and trillions of small parts, which are called cells. Each cell has a nucleus, and within the nucleus are genes. Those genes are basically the code for who we are, what we look like, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, everything about us is determined by those genes.
Yes.
But those genes also carry sometimes conditions that can affect our health, like diseases.
Yes.
And so what we're looking for when we are testing for this genetic carrier screening is we're testing these genes to look to see, is there something there that is being carried, a disease that is being carried that can then be passed on to the next generation. Whereas when we talk about the other screening, that is a screening where we're testing actually the genetic material in the fetus while it is still inside the mother to check to see, is there everything is normal with those genes or whether there is any problem with those genes. So those are two different things. One is testing to see if the parents have a faulty gene that can be passed on to the baby. And the other is actually testing the baby's genes to check to see, is there any problem there? So very important to make that distinction.
I'll quickly ask a very layman question, Doctor, here that when you and that was a very lucid explanation. Thank you for that. So in that case, isn't the first one better than the latter? Because as a woman, if I want to get pregnant, is it not better that before I fall pregnant, I get my genes tested? Or is it better that once I have the fetus, then I go for a genetic testing? Which one is better in terms of getting pregnant and the process involved, Doctor?
So they're both very important and they're both very different from each other. When we talk about having the carrier screening or reproductive carrier screening or genetic carrier screening, that is something that should ideally be done before you get pregnant. Whereas when we are talking about prenatal testing or testing of the fetus, obviously you can't have that test until you're pregnant and there is a fetus.
Yes.
The reason I say that it should be done before you get pregnant is that if a problem is picked up, then you can address that problem, and there are different ways of addressing it, but you can address that problem before you get pregnant, rather than having a test that you have in pregnancy and then have to manage not only the result of the test, but also how it is affecting your pregnancy. So that's the reason for getting it done before you get pregnant. So I'll give you an example. If we have detected a problem, for example, before you get pregnant, then one of the recommendations might be that you try to have IVF for pregnancy rather than get pregnant naturally, so that the IVF can be used to check the embryos before the embryos are put into the uterus for any genetic problems. And we only put in embryos that don't have a genetic problem, which then means that your pregnancy journey is likely to be a little bit more relaxed because you have already tested for it beforehand. You know that the embryos have been tested, and the embryos
Yes.
that have been put into the uterus are the embryos that don't have a genetic problem.
Right. Doctor, I have one more question. There are few, like in my family, we have encountered ankylosing spondylitis, right? So if the mother has it, the child may be a 50% carrier. So the gene might be dominant or recessive in the child. Now, can this problem also be solved while the child is trying to get pregnant? Because this is a major spondylitis problem, right? It's all sorts of complicated spondylitis. Can we also address these kind of complex issues in the human body?
So currently what we have in terms of genetic carrier screening, there are many, many different tests. The very basic tests look at the conditions that are sort of life-threatening, that make a real difference to the lifespan of the person. So currently in Australia, the test that is offered tests for cystic fibrosis, it tests for spinal muscular atrophy, and it tests for something called Fragile X syndrome. That doesn't mean that there aren't other tests available. There are tests that will test for hundreds of conditions. Now, whether a particular condition can be tested or not is something that needs a detailed discussion with a genetic specialist, because there are some conditions that we can test for, and then there are others that we can't test for.
Right. Moving on to you've laid the ground in such an interesting way, Doctor. There are many questions, and this is something that I am very keen to know because sometimes in a lot of South Asian communities, these testings are not always seen positively from a religious point of view. In your experience as a doctor, Dr. Khot, have you ever experienced a patient who is hesitant because the religious mindset is a bit hesitant to get in that field? And if so, how do you encourage the patients to still get this done because this is important?
So, first of all, Chris, it's important that all tests are optional. They're all tests that you should have done if you want to, and you can always say, no, thank you, that's not for me. And
Okay.
religion might be one of the reasons you don't want to have them, but there might be other reasons you don't want to have them, and that is perfectly fine. I think the religious aspect of this sometimes comes with the fact that there is an association with abortion or termination of pregnancy. And some people, some women, some families, for religious reasons, might not want to go down the route of having a pregnancy terminated.
Right.
And in those situations, I always say that this is not about terminating pregnancies. That's just one aspect of it. The other aspect is actually preparing yourself for the future. If you do have a baby who's affected, then you need to be prepared for a future where you'll be looking after a baby that
Yes.
might have a condition that is a lifelong condition. For
Yes.
some conditions, that is actually life limiting. And so, being prepared and knowing that perhaps your child will not live for 50 years, will
Yes.
live a shorter life, is important for people to know before they go into that journey. And so it's not just about one thing, it's about lots of different things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doctor. I've already inundated with you a lot of questions, but now I'll try to come back on track. Doctor, for the general audience like us, what is that 1 in 4 rule or the 25% rule for carrier couples?
So it's important, again, I spoke about genes. The genes are carried on chromosomes, and
Yes.
chromosomes come in pairs. And so certain conditions, if you have just one gene, you will have the condition, and those are usually called dominant conditions. Whereas for other conditions, you need to have two faulty genes to have that condition, and those are called recessive conditions. Now, the person who is a carrier usually has one good and one bad gene. We'll call it bad because, or faulty,
Yeah.
whatever we want to think of it as. Because they have one good gene and one faulty gene, they usually don't have the condition, but they're carrying a faulty gene. And now, if you can imagine, if I have a good and a bad gene, and I get married to someone who also has a good and bad gene, then the possibility is that children could have two good genes, they could have one good and one bad gene, or
Yeah.
they could have two bad genes.
Yes.
And it will be the child who has two bad or faulty genes who will then develop that condition. For example, it might be cystic fibrosis. But if you think about it, it will be 1 in 4 chance of a child getting both the faulty genes and hence having the condition. Chances are that one of your children, if you think about it in probability terms, one of them will not be a carrier at all. One of them will get both good genes. 2 of them will probably get a good gene and a faulty gene, and so will be carriers. But 1 out of those 4 could get 2 faulty genes and hence be affected by the disease itself. So that's the 1 in 4 or 25% rule. And the difficulty with that is that the 1 in 4, you can't predict, right? It's not like the first pregnancy will be this, the second pregnancy will be this, the third pregnancy will be this. It's 1 in 4 for every pregnancy. And so that's what makes it difficult. Like for every pregnancy, there's a 25% chance that you will have a baby who might be affected by the disease.
I was about to ask this very same question, Doctor. Is there a correlation that my firstborn has to have it or the secondborn? But you answered that already. Thank you, Doctor. The other question from there that I have for you is this. You mentioned about the preconception screening, right? Why is that considered that ideal timing to compare to screening during your pregnancy?
So the reason for doing that pre-pregnancy, a couple of reasons. So first of all, if you have the test in pregnancy and the test tells you that both of you are carriers, there is the stress, right, of thinking, now I'm pregnant. What if this baby that I am currently pregnant with is that 1 in 4 babies who has the condition? And then that stress is one thing, and then you might want to have further testing, which is usually invasive testing for the baby, which then carries its own risks of actually losing the baby. They're very small. They tend to be somewhere around 1 in 100, but they are there. And so the stress combined with the fact that you might want to have a test which might have, complications is something that you want to avoid. So you want to have the test beforehand so that then you know what situation you are in. That's one thing. And like I said before, if you have a condition and you have that 1 in 4 chance, you might actually think, hang on, instead of taking that chance with a natural pregnancy, I might go for an IVF pregnancy where I can then have the embryos tested so that the embryos that are put inside the uterus are the ones that don't have both the faulty genes.
Right.
So for both reasons, it's important that the test be done outside of pregnancy. But I also want to say that if for any reason you have not had the test before and you find yourself pregnant, you should still have the test in pregnancy if that is what you want to have, because it will still give you information that will be important for you in your pregnancy.
Doctor, I have 2 questions here. First is, let's say I fall in the second category. I did not get the test before, but now I realize I'm pregnant. I want to go get tested. What is a safe window during my pregnancy tenure that I can get tested? And the other question is, I have heard, and I could be wrong, you are the best person to correct me, that some of the cancers are hereditary. If they are, can genetic carrier testing help us screen for cancerous genes?
So the answer to the first question, there isn't really a safe window. It's a simple test. You can have it at any time. The reason for thinking about that window is if you are thinking that actually, if I am pregnant and I do find out that my baby has a condition that would affect them for their entire life or might actually limit the length of their life, I would want to have a termination. Then there is a window in which you can have a termination of pregnancy, have an abortion. And I think that is the window you need to think of. Otherwise, there's no window. It's a safe test. You can have it at any time in pregnancy. The second question about cancers that can be inherited, again, it's the same thing. Some of them will be able to be tested genetically, others will not. And this field is moving so quickly that what's true today will not be true tomorrow. Today we can't test for a particular thing, but tomorrow there might be a test for it.
Right.
So it's important that you keep that in mind. I usually say to people, if you have a history of a genetic condition, it's really important to talk about the details of that history with your GP, and your GP can then refer you to a specialist genetics counselor who can go through what the genetic background of that particular condition is. It may or may not be genetic. Sometimes we are told, oh, this is genetic, but it might not be necessary, especially in our families, because we don't have exact histories. We get
Yes.
told, oh, grandma died of ovarian cancer, and then mom also died of ovarian cancer, and then some auntie had some other unknown cancer. And so it becomes like a family thing of, there's lots of cancers in our family. But we don't actually know the reality of whether those cancers are related, whether they are
Right.
genetic or not. And so it's important to talk to a specialist who can go through all of that history and give you information that is important and relevant, specific for you.
Right. Doctor, on that note, I'll digress from the scientific field a bit to come to the societal bit, right? You mentioned very correctly that in most of South Asian families, we don't discuss death and illness and all of that as much as we should be. So now let's say there's a young migrant woman who's just arrived into the country with a husband. Nothing has been told to her. She has no idea. My question to you is, how do we raise this awareness among the families, among mothers and daughters and sons and husbands, that you need to talk about these things? How do we do that more often, doctor?
I think it's really important for us to shift our thinking, especially in our communities, about pregnancy being something that just happens versus actually pregnancy is something that we should plan. I think that is a very important shift. If we can shift that, the fact that you plan a pregnancy, then there are so many things that we can do in that phase of planning. And it might be genetic carrier screening is one of them, but it could be things like making sure that you are healthy, making sure you don't have diabetes. In our community, diabetes is so common. And I see lots of women who I see in pregnancy who are diagnosed with diabetes for the first time, but actually they've probably had diabetes for years. It's just that it has never been tested because it has never been something that has been planned. Like if we planned pregnancy, if each one of us thought and said to our daughters, to our aunties, to our neighbors, to our friends, if you are going to get pregnant, plan it. Go see your GP at least a year before you're planning to get pregnant so that you can have all the tests. Make sure that you are entering pregnancy in the best health possible,
Right.
that if there are any health issues, those are actually treated, and you're on the best possible treatment for those conditions before you get pregnant,
Right.
rather than discovering them when you get pregnant. I think that is the most important shift
Exactly.
that we can make in our thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you, doctor. On the next thing that I want to know is, given that, as you mentioned, sometimes we have no family records available, right? How should we reframe the conversation to make this universal screening as a benchmark and a standard?
It's normalizing it. Ultimately, we are talking about our communities, but even within the wider community, within the wider Australian community, this is relatively new. It's not something that has been around for very long. So for all of us, this is very new, and normalizing the conversation and bringing it up all the time is one way of making sure that we become aware. So, if within friends groups, for example, you go out for a coffee,
Yeah.
your good friends talk to each other and ask, so what's happening? Are you planning to get pregnant? If you're planning to get pregnant, have you heard about genetic carrier screening? Have you heard about, making sure that you don't have diabetes? Are you sure that you've had your cervical screening test? Because that's a really important one. Are you sure you've had all your vaccinations? So, it's having those conversations all the time and making it the normal thing to talk about. When
Mm.
we don't talk about things, they become hidden, they become taboo, they become something that is, oh, we don't talk about this because this is not, this is not polite, this is not right, this is something that is only, your private business. Whereas when we talk about it all the time, it just becomes normal, it becomes something that is, part of conversation.
Yes. No, thank you, doctor. Thank you. That is very important to kind of raise awareness. I think it's one way of normalizing the conversation. But coming back to again this the procedural question, doctor, what is the difference between a three gene panel, which is the CF, SMA, or Fragile X syndrome that you mentioned, and expanded carrier screening, which is the ECS?
Yes, so there are three screen panels, screens only for those three conditions. The reason it screens for those three conditions is because those three conditions are relatively more common in the general population, and because they have really serious consequences for people who have those conditions.
Right.
So that's the reason we've chosen to do the three panel screening. There is an expanded carrier screening panel available, which screens for hundreds of conditions. The difference is also that if you are in Australia, the 3 panel is funded. So it is Medicare funded. If you have a Medicare card, it is free. Whereas if you wanted to have the expanded carrier screening, you would have to pay for it.
On that payment question, doctor, I was about to ask you that question is for, let's say, a migrant student, they are on a student visa, they've gotten pregnant. How easily affordable and accessible is that expandable carrier screening if they want to go for it?
Well, it is an expense, and the expense will depend on how many things you're screening for and which test you're using. So the best thing to do is to talk to your GP about it, who will be able to give you an idea of what the cost of various different screening is. And then you can make a decision of whether you want to go ahead or not. Ultimately, you have to decide, you've got whatever money you've got to decide where you're going to spend it. So it's important that you have that discussion with your GP.
Thank you. Doctor, spend a while talking about the good aspects of this process. Why should we get tested? But I also want to go to the other side of the spectrum, which is what is the residual risk of this test if I supposed to get it done? What is the risk that I carry? And how should clinicians explain it to our patients with possible negative results as well?
So one thing is that when we test for these conditions, sometimes we get that very easy positive negative result, but sometimes we get a result that isn't as clear. And so it's important to have that discussion of what to do in the situation where that result is not clear cut. It's not a definite black or white negative positive result. It's gray and in between. What does that actually mean? So that's one thing to discuss, very important. Secondly, it's important to discuss what that result means for you and your health. So it might be that it has implications for your health. So sometimes we find that we do a particular genetic carrier screening test and we discover that the person who's had the test actually does have a variant of a condition or carries a gene that has some high risks associated with it. That has implications for your own health. It also has implications for your insurance. So those are things that must be discussed in the context of having these tests, especially if you're having that expanded carrier screening, because that is testing for a whole lot more conditions.
Yes.
And so it's important to understand what the implications are of those conditions for yourself. The third thing that's really important to also discuss, especially in that expanded carrier screening space, is that we don't always know what that result means for a particular baby. So sometimes it's very clear that, if you have 2 faulty genes for cystic fibrosis, your child will have cystic fibrosis, and this is what cystic fibrosis looks like. This is the disease, this is the condition, this is the life expectancy, this is what living with cystic fibrosis looks like. On the other hand, other genetic conditions are not so clear cut. And so for those genetic conditions, you might not have a very clear answer of what it means to have that particular condition and what the life of a person who's living with that condition looks like. So it's important to have those discussions as well in the context of having genetic carrier screening. I see all the time people who've had expanded carrier screening, something has come up as positive, and now there is this situation where you don't know what to do with that result because there is no clear information about what that condition means, what it means to live with that condition, what effects it's going to have on that child's life. So that is a difficult place to be. And if you've not been warned that that could be something that could come up later, then that's unfair.
True. I agree, doctor. I agree. Doctor, what are the limitations in our current understanding that prevent 100% accurate testing or a screening process?
The difficulty there is that we don't know exactly what a particular gene means for a particular condition. For some conditions, it's very clear. For other conditions, it's not as clear. And so, of course, we need to do more research. We need to find out more. But also, I think there is a little bit of it that will probably never be as clear as the other situations. And so we have to accept that for every test, there is a limitation. There is no test in this world that comes with no limitations. And if anybody tells you that this test is perfect, question it, because no test is perfect. And so similarly with genetic carrier screening, we have to accept that there is a proportion of this test that will not give us information. It is not a perfect test, and we just have to accept that that is how it is.
Absolutely, doctor. One last thing, doctor, because this is such an important conversation and many people would like to know more. So if they were to know more, where can we find you on social media or professionally?
I am on LinkedIn. You can find me very easily on LinkedIn. But if you are looking for resources to get more information, then my advice is to go to reliable places rather than to go to, influencers, people like that. Reliable resources are usually produced by organizations. So, for example, I can talk about RANZCOG. The Royal Australian New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists has some patient information about reproductive carrier screening, which is available to anyone. If you click onto the website, put it into the search bar, it will come up. It's also got some guidelines for clinicians. So, although the guidelines are meant for doctors, anyone can read them. Again, go onto the website, put it into the search engine, it will come up. And within that, if you read that and feel there's something here I don't understand, I have further questions, your GP is the best person to go to have that discussion further. If you feel you don't feel comfortable having that discussion with your GP, there's always the option of asking for a referral to a specialist so that you can have a more detailed discussion. But otherwise, my one piece of advice is go to reliable sources of information.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much, doctor. You've with regards to finding you on social media, you've also covered my next question is what would be your message to our listeners? That you've perfectly summed it up beautifully. Thank you. So to our listeners, this was Dr. Nisha Khot, and we spoke about genetic carrier screening, the importance of it, why do we need to talk about it, why do we need to normalize such conversations, and as Dr. Khot mentioned at the very end, if you've got any doubts or questions about your pregnancy or someone around you, please go to reliable sources. I'll be pinning down the website. If you have more seek of information, you can always visit that website as well. And to Dr. Kaur, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough because every time you're patient with my questions and you give me your valuable time, doctor. Thank you so much for coming on the platform for such an important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris. These are such important conversations to have. And I'm so glad that somebody from the South Asian community is doing this work so that we can spread the message within our community.
Thank you, doctor.